chessboard, which no one has seen. When American and Israeli missiles rained down on Iran on February 28, 2026, the world saw war. But that was just the final move in a game that had been played for a year and a half before the first shot was fired. To understand the brilliance of this move and the series of previous moves, we need to go back to January 2025, to the first day of Donald Trump's second presidency. But before we get into this incredibly interesting and important topic, I want to show you why all the dots and lines converged at the beginning of 2026, not in 2012 or even in 2016. So let's begin. Iran's nuclear program has reached a critical point. For 30 years in a row, the West tried to stop Iran's nuclear program through diplomacy. The 2015 deal under Obama was an attempt to freeze enrichment. We suspect he was playing along with Iran, but it doesn't matter. From America's point of view, it was an attempt. Trump pulled out of it in 2018. After that, Iran began enriching uranium up to 60%. And according to some reports, as I told you, the IAEA detected somewhere around 83.7% when they were measuring something there. That is, 84% is technically already on the threshold of weapons grade. That's 90%. By early 2026, according to intelligence estimates, Iran was just a few weeks away from creating a nuclear device. The window was closing. Another year or two, and an attack would have become impossible because you don't attack a nuclear state. And the second thing is, of course, October 7th, 2023, which actually changed everything. The Hamas attack on Israel broke the old paradigm, which was called deterrence. Israel shifted from a conflict management model to a threat elimination model. As often happens, a catastrophe led to a solution to the problem. Gaza, well, that's Hamas, Lebanon, Hezbollah. The systematic destruction of Iranian proxies. That was the first step. By the end of 2025, Hamas was crushed. Hezbollah was decapitated. The Iranian proxy network, Tehran's main tool for projecting power without direct war, that is, lay in ruins. For the first time in 30 years, Iran was left without a buffer zone. Previously, Iran could threaten Israel through Hezbollah and Hamas without risking its own territory. That shield is gone. Now, another point was that Trump, of course, is not Obama, not Biden, and Bush. Bush Jr. got bogged down in Iraq and Afghanistan. As you can imagine, America had neither the strength nor the desire nor the appetite for a third war. Obama fundamentally believed in diplomacy and a deal with Iran. More precisely, he had his own ideas about this. Well, anyway, Biden was weak and indecisive. Trump is the only president who simultaneously had the political will to strike. And, which is probably no less important, he built up the energy infrastructure. What does that mean? A certain structure that made it possible to withstand the consequences. Because everyone understood there would be consequences. Previous administrations were afraid of oil prices. Trump first created conditions in which the price would not kill the American economy, and only then did he strike. Contemporaries almost never understand geniuses. We know thousands of examples of this. But that doesn't stop geniuses from being geniuses. So, the energy buffer. What exactly did Trump do? For 30 years, the main argument against war with Iran was that Iran would close the Strait of Hormuz, oil would skyrocket to $200, and the global economy would collapse. This argument paralyzed everyone. Clinton, Bush, Obama, Biden, everyone. Trump neutralized it. Record American oil production. Venezuela is under control. Brazil and Guyana. Biden is increasing exports. Saudi Arabia has spare capacity and is cooperating with us. Yes, prices have gone up, but not to catastrophic levels, and America has ways to offset the losses. Let's go back for a second to the Iranian proxies. In 1926, Hamas was defeated, Hezbollah was weakened, and Iranian influence in Syria was undermined. And for the first time in decades, Iran found itself isolated. There was no one left to open another front with. Iran was opening a second, third, fourth, and fifth front. Now there was another reason. Let's call it a technological window. American and Israeli weapons became accurate enough to hit underground targets. If not destroy them, then at least seal them off. So, a 14-ton bomb, the F-35 with stealth technology, cyber weapons capable of disabling systems. 20 years ago, such weapons and such capabilities simply didn't exist in the arsenal. They just weren't there. And now all these factors came together at the same time. Political will, smart preparation, and everything else I mentioned. Technological superiority. Each of them existed separately before, but I don't think all six ever coincided at one point. And Trump, well, there are two versions, and they were discussed in the press. He either saw this opening or he created it. And I have a feeling that he saw an opportunity and started working to make it happen, to create it. What happened over these 14 months was not improvisation, ladies and gentlemen, as we were told all the time. I don't even want to say what I think about these media outlets. It was a multi-step strategic combination where every move, Venezuela, oil expansion, the war with Iran is part of a single plan. The main target that all of this converges on is not even Tehran, ladies and gentlemen. The main target is Beijing. On January 20th, 1925, on the very first day of his second term, Trump signed an order to free American energy. This document removed almost all regulatory restrictions imposed by the Biden administration. Federal lands were opened up for drilling. Licensing was accelerated. You didn't have to wait 23 years, just a few months. The ban on exporting liquefied natural gas was lifted. In other words, develop as much as you want and export it. The result was not long in coming. By the end of 1925, U.S. oil production had reached an all-time record, 13.6 million barrels per day. America began producing 24 million barrels of oil-equivalent fuel a day, more than Russia and Saudi Arabia combined. Offshore production in the Gulf of Mexico, which Trump renamed the Gulf of America, soared to a record 714 million barrels a year, and by early 1926 it was approaching a billion barrels a year. Gasoline prices at American gas stations started to go down, and it dropped to a 4-year low. On average, how much was it? $2.90 per gallon. In 43 states, you could buy gasoline for less than $3. Trump didn't just talk about drilling. He created conditions where drilling became more profitable than ever before. After all, the government, the administration, the president can't improve production or create something, but he can create conditions. That is, he can remove restrictions, solve problems, and so on. This way, business starts to feel freer and says, oh, we can do this, great, and everything immediately starts to grow and develop. Now, Venezuela. So the oil that was taken away from China. To understand the Venezuelan operation, you need to understand the context. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world. How much is there? 300 billion barrels. That's 17% of the world's explored reserves. Under Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro, these reserves turned from a blessing into a curse. Corruption, socialist management. They brought production down from 3.5 million barrels per day. When was that? Well, around 1999 to 2000, down to a miserable 400,000 in 2020. So where did the remaining oil go? The one they barely managed to extract from underground? It went to China. Maduro sold it to Beijing at a 40% discount from the market price. They accepted it, accepting payment in rubles, barter, cryptocurrency, anything. Venezuela became a cheap gas station for China in the Western Hemisphere. Trump changed that with a single stroke. On January 2, 1926, he announced military operations in Venezuela. On January 3, American Special Forces captured Maduro. The operation, which the Pentagon had been preparing, well, I'm sure, for months. It was carried out lightning fast. Triple objective. Well, overthrow. Taking down the narco-dictator. Okay, cutting off drug trafficking. And the key point, control over the flows of Venezuelan oil. On January 6, Trump announced an oil deal. Venezuela will provide the U.S. with between 350 million barrels at market price. At market price. We don't need any discounts. At market price. Already on January 14, the U.S. Department of Energy reported its first sales of $500 million. Here it is in the box from this very deal. The revenue was deposited into accounts controlled by the U.S. Treasury. With one move, Trump achieved several goals. He removed Maduro. He cut off the drug trafficking. He gained access to the largest oil reserves on the planet. And most importantly, he cut China off from 400,000 barrels a day cheap Venezuelan oil. The entire supply scheme that Beijing had been building for years collapsed. At the same time, the Treasury Department issued a series of licenses that opened up Venezuela to American oil companies. Deals with Russia, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, and Chinese entities were strictly prohibited. You get a license, you sign it. If you don't do this, your license will be revoked, regardless of your investment. Plus Venezuelan gold, here's another one, that also went to the U.S. A contract with the trader Trafigura, or Trafiga. Again, I can't read their language. For delivery, how much was it? About 1,000. No, I'm going to get confused now. I don't recall the exact number of gold bars, but there were many. Minister of Internal Affairs Doug Bergen personally flew to Caracas for negotiations. Interim President of Venezuela Delcy Rodriguez signed a reform of the oil legislation, which opened the country to foreign investment. If someone besides America wants to invest, but not Russia, not China, not Iran, not North Korea, not Cuba, and so on. Oh yes, and Brazil, of course. While the world was watching the fight in Caracas, another process was gaining momentum in the south of Latin America. Brazil is the largest economy in South America. It was rapidly turning into an oil superpower. In 1925, oil and gas production reached a historic record. It was about 4.8 million barrels of oil equivalent per day. That's 13.3% more than the previous year. In October 1925, monthly oil production exceeded 4 million barrels per day for the first time in history. Much less than ours, that's clear. Yes, but still. Giant offshore fields in the Santos and Campos basins, hidden beneath the seabed. A thick layer of salt at the bottom of the ocean yielded light, low-sulfur oil of the highest quality. Naturally, our technologies helped there. At the beginning of 1925, Brazil joined what is known as OPEC+. So it was a strategic move that gave access to the cartel's resources without any production limits. Petrobras, the Brazilian state oil company, announced a $109 billion investment plan through 2030. The production cost at Brazilian deepwater fields has dropped below $40 per barrel, with a forecasted decrease to $28. This is an amazing achievement, and here's what's important. Chinese refineries sharply increased their purchases of Brazilian oil in 1925 by 28%. That's almost a third. Brazil was becoming an alternative supplier for China, replacing Iranian and Venezuelan oil. But this alternative had one key feature. Unlike Iran and Venezuela, Brazilian oil was sold at market price, no discounts. The era of cheap sanctioned oil for China was coming to an end. Not over yet, but it's ending. By the start of the war with Iran, the overall picture looked like this. The U.S. had record production. Venezuela was under control. Brazil and Guyana were increasing exports and were also under control. The global oil market was oversupplied. Brent prices fell to 52.62. That's dollars per barrel. America created an oil buffer that allowed it to start a war with Iran without fearing an energy shock. But Iran wasn't just sitting around doing nothing either. They were up to something over there. The Persians. They weren't stupid people. They started building underground cities. While Trump was building the energy architecture, Iran lived in a world it had constructed for itself over 4 decades, long before Trump. It all started during the Iran-Iraq War, somewhere in the 1980s, the early 80s, when Iraqi missiles rained down on Iranian cities. Tehran learned a lesson. They needed to dig in. In 1984, the first underground missile base was built near Kermanshah to shelter Scud missiles obtained from Libya and North Korea. The second lesson came in 1991 when Operation Desert Storm, though not in their country but in Iraq, destroyed the Iraqi army, the largest in the Middle East, by the way, in just a few days. Entirely by air power simply from above. Iranian strategists understood that in open combat with the Americans, they had no chance. The only hope is to survive the first strike and retain the ability to respond. That's how Iran's doctrine of passive defense was born. It was launched in 1989, moving everything important deep into the mountains. And for the next 35 years, Iran built and completed 30 underground facilities. They call them missile cities. There are more than 100 interconnected tunnels stretching for dozens of kilometers inside the mountains. The construction was overseen by the IRGC engineering headquarters, which had no less than 135,000 employees, an army of builders and engineers. The scale is impressive. Some tunnels are 6 meters high, some even 10 meters and 6 meters wide, stretching for kilometers deep into the mountains. Automated rail systems for transporting missiles, ballistic missiles standing vertically in storage, ready to launch without cranes or loaders. Elite top-tier bases at a depth of 120 to 450 meters in granite rock, where not even the most powerful American bomb can reach. The core of the base is embedded 500 meters deep into granite, one of the hardest rocks on Earth. Multiple exits from each missile city, decoy openings that are camouflaged, mountainous terrain, engineering teams inside the complexes to clear blocked entrances, ventilation, backup electricity, fuel reserves, and food supplies. Well, Iranian generals were absolutely sure their country was not dead, not vulnerable. The commander of the IRGC Aerospace Forces, Amir al-Hajizadeh, boasted, "If we open one missile city per week, it won't end for another 2 years." Well, everyone quickly calculated how many they had. In a video released in March 2025, Hajizadeh and Chief of General Staff Mohammad Bakari were driving through giant tunnels filled with missiles. Shikan, Sejil, Hajqasam, and Pave cruise missiles. But the underground cities had a second function, not just for missiles. Keshem Island in the Hormuz Strait, a geological wonder with salt caves and mangrove forests, hid underground bases with fast boats and anti-ship missiles beneath its coral crust. Their purpose is the same, to control the Hormuz Strait. Now I will tell you about the Hormuz Trap. On February 28, 2026, war began after negotiations failed, during which Iran refused nuclear disarmament. As you know, the American and Israeli air forces struck Iranian military infrastructure. Iran did exactly what was expected. They closed the Hormuz Strait, laid mines, threatened to attack any vessel, and effectively halted all movement. Brent prices soared above $100. The head of the International Energy Agency called this the biggest violation of energy security in the history of the planet. The Philippines declared an energy emergency, New Zealand started issuing gasoline ration cards, and Malaysia switched officials to remote work. The Iranian logic was simple. The world would suffocate without Hormuz oil and force America to stop, and the whole world would start talking. Well, just like our Democratic Party, start a war. But this logic seemed catastrophically flawed for one very simple reason. Because we have President Donald J. Trump, who wouldn't have started this war if he wasn't ready for exactly this turn of events. Iran says we're blocking the strait. Trump says fine. And I can block it better than you. On the morning of March 10, the U.S. Navy blockaded Iranian ports throughout the Persian Gulf, while ships in the Gulf of Oman traveling between non-Iranian ports were allowed to pass freely. It was a targeted economic chokehold on Iran over the closure of the strait, but not for everyone, only for those we wanted to deny passage to. Now, regarding the underground missile cities, they have done their job. So 77% of the visible tunnel entrances were hit, but engineering teams inside the mountains quickly restored the facilities, clearing the debris in a matter of hours, literally pouring fast-drying concrete of fantastic strength. U.S. intelligence admitted that only the destruction of a third of Iran's buried missile arsenal has been confirmed. We destroyed 90% of what they had that was visible there, and as it turned out, we destroyed a third of what was hidden. But strategically, it didn't matter at all because what really mattered were the underground cities and the task of survival, while Iran was losing the war on the surface. The economy was strangled, the ports were blocked, and oil and elite exports only made it through to China. By the way, 1.2 million barrels per day instead of the pre-war, 2.1 million, so only half. Iran spent 40 years and billions of dollars creating an underground shield. The shield worked, yes, of course, the missiles survived, but the strategy failed because Trump turned their logic upside down. You can sit in a bunker as long as you want, but if the world has changed, it doesn't matter. Then your tunnels are just a sarcophagus. And now we're getting to the main point, to what neither Tehran nor most world analysts have seen. The war with Iran was not so much about Iran as it was about China. The numbers speak for themselves. China is the world's largest oil importer, with 11.5 million barrels per day. In 2025, over 55% of imports came from the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, the Emirates, Oman. Through the Strait of Hormuz, 5.3 million barrels passed into China every day. That's a third of all Chinese supplies. When the strait was closed, that third disappeared. Overnight, deliveries dropped to 1.2 million barrels per day. That is, half of it was exclusively Iranian oil, which at that time was making its way through a military zone, but that's it. This was already the second blow. The first was that Venezuela had already cut China off from 400,000 barrels of cheap oil per day. 2 months earlier, over the course of 14 months, Trump consistently destroyed two pillars, I would even say both pillars, of China's energy strategy for cheap sanctioned oil, Venezuela and Iran. And stable transit through Hormuz. Beijing was preparing for it, but not enough. In the first 2 months of 2026, Chinese oil imports jumped by 16%. They were frantically building up reserves, pouring in. Russia set up supplies at 300,000 barrels per day, but that's catastrophically little. Russian supplies cover, 2.21 million barrels per day, while through Hormuz, China was getting 5.4 million barrels per day. Do you feel the difference? Russian pipelines are at full capacity and can't be increased further. It's limited, and even then only partially. This is the shadow fleet, and they're being hunted. China's strategic oil reserve is impressive, 1.2 billion barrels, but it will only last for 109 days. But that's not a solution, just a delay. 3 months. On March 5, major Chinese refineries received a government order to stop accepting new fuel export contracts. China has shifted into austerity mode. This is the scariest thing for manufacturing and for the economy, which are already struggling after the pandemic. Bruegel analysts calculated that a 25% increase in oil prices reduces China's GDP by 0.5%, and prices have risen by more than 25%, much more than 25%. They doubled from $60 to $116 per barrel. This is for the defense of democracies. The Washington think tank identified 3 points, 3 possible pressure points on Beijing. The first is dependence on sanctioned oil. The second is vulnerability to American trade investigations. And the third is Chinese financial institutions that process payments for sanctioned oil. Analyst Alpine Mock told CNBC that the direct U.S.-China rivalry is the main thread tying Venezuela, Iran, and Greenland into a single strategy. Ladies and gentlemen, the U.S.-China rivalry is the main thread connecting Venezuela, Iran, and Greenland into a single strategy, CNBC reported in January 2026. Venezuela, Iran, and Greenland are part of Trump's single plan for energy and critical minerals. The closure of the Hormuz Strait affected not only oil. Qatar, the world's largest LNG exporter, declared force majeure on the contract. What does this mean? We can't fulfill them, and it's not our fault. But for those expecting to receive, it doesn't matter who's at fault. They're just not getting it. The Iranian strike on the Ras Laffan complex reduced Qatar's production capacity by 17%, and just repairing the damage from this strike will take 3 to 5 years. Everything will need to be fixed. In Iran itself, Asian LNG prices have jumped by 140%. China, which was rapidly converting its economy to gas, took a severe blow. As a result, China found itself in a bind. It's not expensive, but the supplies are unstable. And for America, even though it has enormous naval power, it's not enough to protect the sea routes. China has 3 aircraft carriers compared to America's 11, and none of them can project power. In the Persian Gulf, Russia can't help fully. Its capabilities are stretched to the limit. Russia is stuck, Venezuela itself is lost, and Iran is under bombardment. You won't get much from there either. That's what Foreign Policy, the organization, wrote. Before the war, 5.35 million barrels per day went through China. After the war started, 122, and only Iranian oil is a catastrophe. Period. And they also called one person in the United States of America a grandmaster. Guess who? Now let's put the whole picture together and look at it as a chess game. Move 1.
Январь 25-го.
Energy expansion within the country. There is a decree lifting restrictions on the American energy sector. The beginning of the path to record production of 136 million barrels per day. I understand that numbers don't really matter to you. They don't mean anything, but that's an incredible amount. America is creating an oil buffer that will allow it to withstand any price shock. Here is the 2nd January 26 Venezuela. Maduro's capture control over the largest oil reserves on the planet, cutting off China, cheap oil in the Western Hemisphere, simultaneously striking at drug trafficking and strengthening its position in Latin America. Here is February 3rd, 26. War with Iran, destruction of the nuclear program, closure of the Hormuz Strait, which Iran considered its trump card. And this was turned into a trap for Iran itself and became a strategic weapon against China. 4th, the blockade of the Iranian blockade. It sounds funny, right? The blockade of the Iranian blockade, interception of the Strait. Iran lost its only card. Now they can only threaten to shoot in different directions. The world has already started building routes bypassing Hormuz, pipelines through Saudi Arabia, the Red Sea, through the Emirates, and through the Gulfs to America. America is an energy superpower with record production and control over Venezuelan oil. Iran is bombed, blockaded, sitting in bunkers with missiles, but without an economy and soon without money. China is the world's largest oil importer, cut off from cheap supplies and slowing down its economy. Calling it chess in the 4th or even 5th dimension is an understatement. Ladies and gentlemen, Trump wasn't just playing against Iran. He was playing against the entire geopolitical configuration formed by China, Iran, and Venezuela. The axis of cheap energy undermining American dominance, which we simply could not allow. He destroyed that axis. He undermined it in just 14 months. One piece after another, consistently, methodically, relentlessly until the end. It remains to be done. It remains to be done. Problems, yes, problems. But Iran thought that their underground cities were the ultimate weapon. They had been building them for 40 years. Hundreds of kilometers of tunnels, thousands of rockets in granite mountains. But it turned out that the ultimate weapon isn't concrete and granite. The ultimate weapon is thought, it's strategy, it's the ability to see the whole board at once. Your opponent is only looking at his own corner. Iranian generals were looking at Hormuz, Chinese strategists were watching their oil reserves, and Trump was looking at the whole planet and moving the pieces. I'm always surprised that Trump's critics very quickly forget what they predicted earlier. It turned out they didn't understand what Trump was doing. Then what happened was that they would already skip ahead and start criticizing Trump for his next move, and again, they didn't understand. Let's at least recall one episode. Well, during his campaign speeches back in 2015 and 2016, Trump kept saying that a wall would be built between Mexico and America, and that Mexico would pay for it. Yes, well, you remember that all the Democrats, as well as the Mexican government and the government, America's friends laughed about this and used Trump's statement as an example, saying that he was naive, foolish, and didn't know what he was talking about at all. I remember Trump said, they said that, those Mexicans. Right now, at this moment, the wall grew by another section. It became even higher. It sounded absolutely absurd. Yes, let's move a little forward and we'll find that the Mexican government sent 500 soldiers to form a wall out of them, protecting the American-Mexican border from illegal migrants who were coming from Mexico towards America. All of this was done at the expense of the Mexican government. So Trump made Mexico pay for the construction of the wall to stop illegals from entering America. As soon as it became clear that what Trump was saying wasn't nonsense and was actually happening before our eyes, all the Democratic media outlets immediately stopped talking about it and switched to some other topic. I don't even remember what they switched to. Maybe it was about what Trump said about the leader of North Korea. Well, because of what Trump said. I can't guarantee the accuracy, but basically that's correct, so that he's this little chubby rocket man, something like that. And that America has missiles that are much bigger, they fly farther, are more accurate, and the missiles themselves are much more powerful than anything North Korea has in its arsenal. I remember there was also an outcry from all over the world. They said a nuclear war, Armageddon, would start, but North Korea is not independent, it's more like a chained dog. And no nuclear war started at any point during Trump's presidency from then on. Yes, not a single missile was launched toward Japan or in any other direction where American bases or American soldiers were located. As soon as this happened, of course, the Democrats just started trying to look for something else that they didn't understand again and started laughing about it again. They're always laughing at something and saying what an idiot he is. Then they go quiet because something happened, and then again they find something else somewhere to say that he's an idiot. All right, let's move closer to the epilogue. At the time of writing these lines, April 2026, the Trump-Xi-China summit, originally planned for March and then pushed to mid-May, I think around May 14th to 15th in Beijing. The question that all analysts are asking themselves is whether the pressure on Chinese oil supplies was planned as a goal of the war or was it a side effect? Here are a few organizations, serious guys, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Newsweek, and several Republican senators. They say it was planned. They say this is not a coincidence. This is a grandmaster's move. We'll finish here for today.